Riles, and I live at 726th Avenue East, Bradenton, Florida. And I am sitting here in my home speaking this 7th day of February, 1981. My father was Samuel C. Cobb, and my mother was Annie Gilman Cobb. And I was born, the first child born on Anna Maria Island on May 2nd, 1897. My father and mother came from the state of New Jersey to Florida in 1891. After they moved around some, they lived in Tampa for a few years, and they finally discovered this beautiful island of Anna Maria off the coast on the Gulf of Mexico. And my mother had been ill, and she thought it would do her a lot of good if she could come down to this island and stay for a while. They knew a family named Hall. That was the first family that settled on Anna Maria at the north end of the island, and they had a dock at which the little steamboat could land. So my mother came down and stayed with them for a while. Well, she fell in love with Anna Maria, and she persuaded my father to make their home here on this island. And they found that land was open for homestead, so they selected an available site and filed for homestead. It took 3 years to prove up on the land, and of course my father had to make a living, and the land was just primitive forest. So they just cleared a space in the forest and built a house, a 2-story house of lumber, and with the help of a couple of other men. And my mother stayed there, and my father worked on in Tampa. Someone had to be at least 6 months out every year on that land, the family, the husband or wife, or both, in order to receive ownership of the land. Well, my father worked in Tampa off and on, and he would commute back and forth, usually by schooner, sailboat, because there was not always a steamboat running. But he would get home as often as he could and bring supplies. And meanwhile, my mother had a rowboat, and she could row 3 miles to Cortez and 3 miles back to buy groceries and other necessities, which she did. And we children usually stayed at home. My sister was 6 years older than I and a very responsible person, and she took care of us while Mother was absent. My mother also had a large garden and grew produce, green food, fresh food, and the government had 2 stations with soldiers guarding the mouth of the Tampa Bay into the Gulf from any marauders. And there was a fort on Egmont Key and a fort on Mullet Key. And those soldiers came over and bought our produce and also the produce that the Hall family grew. My sister's name was Maisie Cobb, and my brother's name was Louis Samuel Cobb, named for an uncle, Louis. And there was a 3-year gap between each of us. So my sister was 6 years older, my brother was 3 years older than I, and Our principal occupation was going swimming and shelling, and the beach was wide and beautiful. Oh, beautiful beach we had. And we sailed the boats and played in the water and just really enjoyed life. It was a very delightful way to live and come along. The whole family was 5 children. There was 4 girls and 1 boy. And they, of course, played with us, and we had our Christmas together at one house or the other, a big Christmas celebration. Everybody on the island was there. At the Hall homestead, it was originally taken up by Mrs. Hall's father, and that was George Bean. And the first family that came onto the island, really, was the George Bean family. And they left, the Beans left, and the homestead was transferred to the Halls. That was Mr. Bean's daughter and her husband and their children. And that was at the north end of the island, and the next little homestead was taken up by a man named Berg, and I only know him as Buddy Berg. I don't know his entire name, but he only got a smaller triangular piece of land because the land is all laid out for homesteads by geodetic survey, and that's all that was available for him. And the rest of us, most of the other homesteaders, got the 165 acres, which my parents did. The next homestead, going from north to south, was the Cunningham. And his name was Nelson Cunningham, and he was the homesteader, but he had a brother. There were just the 2 bachelors that never married. He had a brother, Cyrus, and they had both been railroad conductors, and Nelson was retired, and Cyrus was still working, and unfortunately he died before he could retire and join his brother. Then his brother sold out and went to Tampa. And the next homestead was Mr. Watson, Herbert D. Watson. He was from England. Oh, yes, and let's go back to Cunningham. They were from England, too. And Herbert T. Watson was from England, and he was a bachelor when he homesteaded, and he had his father with him part of the time. The rest of the time, he commuted between St. Petersburg and Anna Maria because he taught violin. He was a very fine violinist, and he was busy in St. Petersburg teaching violin. But he stayed at least 6 months out of every year on the island, which was required to hold your homestead. Any homesteader had to spend at least 6 months on his homestead out of each year for 3 years. And Mr. Watson finally sold out and moved to St. Petersburg and married in his middle age. Then the next homestead was ours, Samuel C. Cobb and Annie G. Gilman Cobb. And we got the almost the full 160 acres. The only reason we didn't get the full acreage was that a man named Gallenlock had squatted. They used that term to mean that he spent some of his time there and had a little building, but he had never filed for homestead. So when my father filed for homestead, Mr. Gallenlock immediately filed too, but he was only allotted that small portion of the land that he had cleared, about 3 acres. But that cut off the bay shore from us, a good bay shore. And my mother then purchased from the next homesteader, John R. Jones, south of us, purchased a 10-acre strip, which gave us a good bay shore. And the next homesteader below the south of John R. Jones was Jose Maria Casañas. He was a Spaniard from the Canary Islands, and he had come first to Cuba and then fished for mullet on the coast of Cuba and shipped his fish back to Cuba, because our mullet here on the Florida coast was a different kind and a better kind, the Cuban spot. And he spoke very little English, but Mr. Jones, being well educated and a lawyer, he coached Mr. Casañas, and Casañas learned to recite the Constitution of the United States, and that enabled him to file for homestead and get it. Then the next homestead south was Rorick E. Cobb. That was my father's brother and his family homesteaded there. And they got the full 160 acres. And then the next homestead south of that was a Mr. Riles. He was a retired druggist, and he finally sold out and left there. But the south end of the island, on the south end of the island, there was a number of houses built by people who lived in Tampa and spent their vacations down there. And they occasionally rented their houses to other people. And they had a dock, a wharf, at which schooners could tie up, and a little steamer that operated hit or miss, also tied up there, bringing passengers and freight. So that gave us two wharfs on the island, the one at the north end that the Halls built, and the one at the south end where these Tampa people built for receiving freight and passengers.
And there was a question I want to ask you. You were referring to those houses down at the south end of the island. Were those people like squatters, or were they able to buy lots?
No, they were not squatters. They bought lots, but I don't know who owned that south end of the island. It was someone who came along after we had homesteaded, and no one had taken up that property for a while, and whether they could buy it direct from the government or some other way, I really don't know. That's one thing I don't know.
That's interesting. Well, then that takes in the full island now of the position of the property. Now, you were talking about the squatter that was on your parents' property. Now, could you identify where he had squatted?
Oh yes, it would be bordering on. What's the name of that bayou?
Well, you mean Rum Pete's there? I don't know the name of the bayou.
On that little bayou where the Pete Renard restaurant is now. This property that Mr. Gowanlock had squatted on and was allotted to him to homestead, only about 3 acres, cut my parents off from access to the natural channel that comes into that bayou from the main channel that runs up and down the bay, a natural channel. And so my mother purchased the adjoining land from Mr. Jones's homestead so that we could have access to that bayou. And to have access to it by dock, we had to build a dock out into the bay, straight out from our property, and then turn and cross and go north until it was bordered on that natural channel. So that gave us access to the little channel and then the main channel from that.
You had mentioned about your father building the house. I'm kind of curious, how did you achieve or get the lumber?
Well, the lumber came from by schooner from Tampa, and it was rough pine lumber from trees that had never been turpentined. And termites don't attack that kind of lumber, and the pieces of lumber that were used later in the dock are still on that dock down there on the island after all these years.
Well, that's interesting. How big a house did he build?
It was 2 stories, and at first it was just 4 rooms, 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs, and had a porch across the front, downstairs and upstairs. And from that upstairs porch, we could see the big ships coming in the channels from the Gulf, the sailing ships, and at one time we saw a full-rigged, square-rigged ship, the only one that came through in my lifetime, I think. And my father called us up to that upstairs porch so that we could look through his spyglass, they call it, a telescope, and see that ship bowing gracefully in the groundswell as she came in through the path.
That's beautiful. Would there be a way you could identify your 160 acres on the island using the landmarks we have today? Where would you say it was located at that time?
Well, the south border of our homestead would be 52nd Street, and that was after my mother bought the 10-acre strip, because that road that crosses the island right there where the 2 banks are would be the south border of our first homestead. And that is the Island Bank on the north side of the street and that savings bank on the south side of the street. And then extended north a mile and joined the Watson homestead.
About where would that be in relation to the island now?
Well, it would be a mile north of there. That's about all I can say.
About a mile north.
Uh-huh.
Well, that was a lot of property.
About a mile north of the...
Anna, you had mentioned that your mother was ill and that she had moved in with some people on the island. I'm kind of curious, how did your parents hear about the island to come to it?
Well, to begin with, my father had met this author that had written books about different parts of the United States, and he was down here in Florida gathering data for another book. And this, I don't recall his name, but this author and Claire Jones, who was a son of the John R. Jones that homesteaded here, and my father and a couple of other people of that those kind of interests got together to discuss the writing and the history of the island, and the history of Florida. And they talked about Anna Maria Island. This Claire Jones knew about it because his father had already filed for homestead here. And this other writer was interested too and was visiting here. And so my father thought that would be a very nice place to send my mother. My mother had been ill with typhoid fever, and she had lost a young baby because she was ill and it didn't have proper care. And so then my father inquired and learned about the Hall family being on the island, and that would be a nice place to send my mother. And that's when Mother came down to Anna Maria Island, and she just was entranced with it. It was just a wonderful place, and she was disgusted with Tampa because it was so disease-ridden, typhoid fever and yellow fever and smallpox and everything run rampant. Of course, it's a seaport, and that's what you find in a seaport.
It's very swampy?
Yes, and at that time there was practically no sanitation. you know. And so she wanted to get away from there. And my father, of course, visited down here and found that land was available for homestead, and they decided to move down here.
Now, was it just your mother and father, and was your brother and sister with them at the same time?
Yes, my sister, 6 years older than me, and then my brother, Louis S. Cobb, was 3 years younger than my sister, and I was the youngest. Well, I was born after they moved down here, you know.
Were there any other family members that came down to the island when they came?
Not when my father came. My Uncle Rorik that homesteaded also on the island. They came later, but only about a year later, because there was still homestead land available.
Where did he locate? South or north of you?
South. South, and that's their place was called Ilexhurst, and that's where that big building stood for a while. It was a 3-story building, and that was built by the German people who developed the phosphate mines in Florida. And nearly all of those phosphate mines were developed by German capital and German people who came to the United States for that purpose. And
well, you mentioned the 3-story building. Did it have a name?
it was the clubhouse, Ilexhurst Clubhouse. And it was the clubhouse of these German people, and my uncle had stock in it, and he was the one that arranged for the building on his property, and it was a lease arrangement of his property for that purpose. And they built a long dock out to the steamer channel. My father was a contractor that built the dock, and a warehouse on the end of it, and then they had a motorized boat, a good-sized motorized boat that they came and went from Tampa.
Would that be in the location of, I think they refer to it as
Gulf Park.
Sandpiper, well, Gulf Park Trailer
Gulf
Park and
Park.
the hotel, that
Yes.
area there, which is now called the Sandpiper Trailer Park, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
That's right.
Did they have any children?
Yes, they had 3 children. Emerson was the oldest son, and then the daughter Beatrice, and the youngest was another Louis R. Cobb. Louis Rorik Cobb was their younger son.
So that made 3 Cobb children on the island.
That made 6 Cobb children on
I
the
beg your
island.
pardon, 6 Cobb children.
Yeah.
Now, how many children were on the island in those early days?
Well, there was the whole family, and they numbered 5 finally, but their youngest child was the only one born on the island. That was Clarence. And the others were born in Tampa, I suppose. They had lived in Tampa.
Well, how did you get schooling?
Well, we finally had school in the winter of 1912, I believe. And Miss Gertrude Bear came and taught school, and she boarded with the Rorik Cobb family, and the Rorik Cobb family supplied the schoolhouse, and my father supplied the furniture for it. And we had about 6 months of schooling that year. And I registered as 6 years old, although I was 4 years old. And my cousin Louis registered as 6 years old, but he was 5. And then the other children were of school age. And there was the 6 Cobb children in school that year, and 1 Hall girl, and that was Edith, the oldest one, and she was 6 years old, or 7. I couldn't say for sure, but she was really of school age. But they lived so far away that she couldn't come regularly, but she came as often as she could.
How did you get to school?
Well, usually my mother took us to school in the wagon drawn by a horse, and we walked home in the afternoon. Unless it was raining or stormy, then she would come and pick us up. but otherwise we walked home 3 miles, about 3 miles.
Oh, how long did you go to school at that time?
We had 6 months.
You only 6 months of school.
That's it.
Well, where did you go to school after that then?
Well, the next time we went to school, I don't know what the whole family did with their children, but we moved to Tampa. And we stayed there the school year, and our intention was to stay there until we could get our schooling, but I was very sick with malaria, and they thought they were really going to lose me, so they moved back to the island when school was out. When I went to Tampa, I was a chubby little thing, but when I came back, I was a living skeleton. And it took me about several months to get over that, but you know, the mosquito that carries malaria is a freshwater mosquito, and you live around salt water and on salt water, you don't ever have malaria. So I got rid of that, you know, by just being away from freshwater mosquitoes. And then the next school was on my father's property, and he furnished the schoolhouse and the same furniture we used before. And there was a Miss Alice Wilson of Bradenton. Miss Alice Wilson of Bradenton. Taught that next year, and then the year after that, Miss Leola Ross of Palmetto taught.
Well, was that in your house, or?
Oh, that wasn't in our the house that we lived in. It was the second house that my father had built, and that was a half mile from our house, and up near the border of the Watson homestead. And it had been built for some people who farmed our land, our farmland, and my father was in the boat building business then, and he wasn't farming or anything like that. And these people lived in our house and farmed the land, and they gave us just simply vegetables and things like that to pay for the rent. No money exchange.
How many years was that school in operation?
Well, that was just 2 years.
Were it still the same children in that class as was in the previous one?
No, there was two Spanish girls, and Casanas, Mr. Casanas' granddaughters came. His daughter was staying with him that winter, and their father was a barber, and he had a barber shop in Tampa and a barber shop in Key West, and went back and forth so much that his wife wanted to stay down there on the island and with her father. And her husband had come down whenever he could and be with them, because he wasn't doing any work in his two barber shops. He was just overseeing them, you know. And so we had a lovely winter that winter with that Spanish family that we just loved and enjoyed so much. And I had two little girls, Consuelo and Marie, and later she changed her name to Mary because she wanted to be more American, you know.
Well, after the 2 years there, where did the school move to?
Well, then there was 1 year that it was taught right in our other house, because we were not using that other building, and it was not in condition to be used. And that the next year it was taught right in my mother's living room. And there was fewer scholars. The Hall family had moved away, and there was my aunt, who was a widow, my mother's twin sister, was a widow from Connecticut, and she came down and taught school, and she had her 3 boys, and then there was our 3, made 6, and the 2 little Spanish girls made 8 students.
What about the other 3 Cobb children from you? Okay.
Well, they had moved away in Tampa. They had moved back to Tampa.
Now, how long was that established, that residence established as a school?
1 year.
1 year. All right, the next question, where did the school move to?
Well, then my father, in the meantime, built another house out of the lumber of the other second house. He tore that down and built another house closer to our own home. And my aunt was established in that house, and she taught the school in that house for a year. And then it was moved up to Anna Maria. Anna Maria was developing, and they built a schoolhouse, and the children all went up there.
Now, you mentioned that you had 6 months of school in the first school building. Did you continue with that in the other school buildings?
No. The years that my aunt taught there, we only had 4 months each of the 2 years. 4 months. But of course, my father furnished the schoolroom for nothing, and the first year we boarded the aunt and the 3 boys for nothing, and we also did the second year that she taught 4 months.
Well, when it was moved to the third location, was it still only 4 months?
No, we had 9 months, a full 9 months, and my parents boarded the school teacher for free. She received the wonderful pay of $30 a month.
Oh, my goodness. Well, we've gone through the schooling, Anna. Could you tell us what businesses were on the island that you first remember?
Businesses? That is a joke. The first business really was Captain Castañas had a fishing crew and a camp on the bay shore. And he had these men helping him, and they would fish with seines and get the mullet together, and they would ship it by schooners to Cuba, and he would pay off his crew. And then later Cortez began icing and shipping fish from there. And then he could take it to Cortez and sell it to the fish house there and pay off his crew. And that really was the first business that was established on the island. And then those who farmed, which was my father farmed some, and the Hall family farmed some, and we sold to the fort. And I can tell you a cute little story about Mr. Hall and my father going over to the fort, to Fort Dade. And they come up to the dock, and the wind was high, and the waves were high. And my father went forward and threw a loop of cable around the pylon there, and the boat hit the dock, and he fell overboard. And then the waves took the boat back with a jerk, and Mr. Hall fell overboard. So they were both in the water. But they were both used to the water, and they clambered back into the boat, you know. And my father gave out a few choice words, but Mr. Hall was a very religious man. He genuinely was, not false religion, but genuine. And he couldn't use those kind of words, so all he could say was, "Oh dear, oh dear." So then the next business. Now, when you had to buy groceries and supplies, you had to go to Cortez, or you had to go to Bradenton, or you had to go to Tampa. Well, my father built a nice sloop, sailboat, cabin boat, and Mr. Hall also had such a boat as that. And Cunningham had a boat like that. John R. Jones had a boat like that. So there was always boats available. We always had transportation. But it was nice when business came to the island. And I guess the first real business was Johnson's store at the foot of the pier when Anna Maria Beach began to be developed. And George Bean was now that's the son of the original Bean. he bought up a lot of land there and he developed Anna Maria Beach. He built that pier on the bay where the docks land, and it's still there. That pier is still there, the original one. And at the foot of that dock, on the north side of the street, there was a two-story building built by a man named Johnson. And he had a grocery store. He also had ice, and it came by boat from Tampa in large 300-pound cakes, you know. And he had this insulated part of his store that he kept that ice. Well, really, he kept that to keep his own supplies fresh, but he would sell some in an emergency to people who needed it, you know, especially sick people. So then other businesses sprang up. There was a bathhouse built on the Gulf side, and excursions came by steamer Thursdays and Wednesdays and Sundays, always Sundays, big excursions. Hundreds of people came and used the bathhouse and bathed in the Gulf, and then the hotel was built, and that was on the corner opposite where the post office is now.
How did they have lighting?
Well, the only electric plant on the island belonged to that hotel, and it served the hotel and the bathhouse and the pavilion. A pavilion is now a little theater, but it was an open-air pavilion then, and they had a dance instructor and a piano player, and it was a nice social place, very nice. And there, the hotel's electric plant served a number of cottages, but B.J. Johnson's store had a Delco system, and that was their light and also their heat.
Now, this pavilion, where was that located?
It was right on the Gulf Beach, right close to the beach, and it was at the end of that Pine Street.
Pine?
Yeah,
Now,
end of Pine Street.
was there any land further out in the Gulf?
Only a
than
broad
what is there
beach.
now?
Well, it was a nice, wide, very wide beach there. You see, the ends of the islands were bigger and broader. In fact, the island was longer at the time then by around a mile, I guess, because it extended out into the Gulf and protected a little island called Passage Key, and that was a bird preserve for years, and it was large enough that there was, well, it was 5 acres anyway of high land there, I mean, above high tide, you know, where the birds nested, and a man stayed there during the nesting months to protect the eggs and the squabs from people taking them, you know. And when he moved out there for his stay, he had a good-sized boat. He took a horse with him and plows and harrows and stuff like that and cultivated that 5 acres. And he could sell all his produce without any trouble at all, you know, fresh produce. And then he'd move his horse and his equipment back to Bradenton when the season was over, you see. Well, when the channels, Northwest Channel and Longboat Key Channel, were dredged, widened, and deepened, that it threw currents against these ends of the island till it cut off both ends. The south end was cut off way back, and it's been dredged up and replaced. And you can see the abutment of the original bridge across from Anna Maria to Longboat. It's way out in the middle of the path now.
Were you here when that bridge was built?
The original build? I was in Tampa.
You were in Tampa at that time. Now, in establishing, you say that there was a lot of beach front on the Gulf side. Would you care to estimate how much land or beach land was out there in comparison to what is established now in 1981?
Close to half a mile.
Close to a half a mile out there.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
And the water was shallow enough, out there that people could, even people who were not swimmers, could dare to wade out quite a ways and bathe.
has the bay section been changed much?
Oh, yes, all along the bay section, the bayfront has changed because, swampy places, there were nothing but mangrove swamps.
I mean, in land, from erosion, has erosion done anything to the bayside that you've been able to observe?
Erosion has changed, yes, very much, very much. And natural erosion, the result of channels being dredged out and deepened, has made all the difference in the world between the way it was. Now, there was definite points and bars. School Key, now it's Key Royal. Key Royal was partly swampy and partly highland, and it's been contoured and dredged, and it's a lovely island now, but it had a long bar that extended out into the bay towards the east, and that was a fine place to fish just north of there. There was a deep channel that dropped right off where you could always get trout. Wonderful trout fishing there. But that has been cut into so much that you can't identify it hardly where Skokie Bar used to be.
Now, we were discussing about the first businesses, and you mentioned about the first grocery store, Mr. Johnson's grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
Now, would you recall what other stores came about?
Well, the cottages to rent was a big business there. And the hotel was going, had a lovely dining room, and an aunt of mine, that is an aunt by marriage, she was a widow of an uncle of mine, and her oldest son, and she had 2 daughters with her, and they operated that store, the restaurant in the hotel. And when these excursions came down, twice a week, and especially the Sunday excursion, they were very busy. And also there was a man and his wife and 2 children came down and wanted to open a small restaurant on the bayside, and B.J. Johnson bought a little cottage and moved it up against his store and joined it to his store and equipped it for them, and they had a little restaurant there that was quite popular the other stores that grew up were, of course, the grocery store, that the IGA store came somewhat later than that, a few years later, and that has been very successful. And there's been many, many stores on the island, that grew up, but those were the originals.
How about churches? Were you there when the first churches were built?
When Rosa Memorial Church was built, I was there.
Could you establish the year, maybe, that it was built?
Mm-hmm. The year it was built. 1912, I believe.
1912.
It would be 1911 or 1912.
Were there any places for you to go to church prior to that?
No, we had Sunday school in our home prior to that for a while, when there was enough young people around, and it was just come and go because people came and went so much, They weren't permanent residents like my cousins. They were there and they were gone, One year they might be there, another year in Tampa or back at Connecticut or someplace. Oh. In 1902, the people of Anna Maria petitioned for a post office. They had received mail prior to that time at the residence of the Johnson family living on Palmasola Island at the area where the North Bridge comes across to Anna Maria now. Then later at Cortez, where a Mr. Brown had a post office in his general store. The Anna Maria post office was granted, and my father was postmaster, assisted by my mother. A Mr. Bishop, living at that time on the Gallon Lock property, was the mail carrier between the island and Cortez, from where it was dispatched to Bradenton.
And he got the mail by boat? Did he pick it up by boat?
Yes, it came by boat. At first, he only had a rowboat, but he got tired of that very soon and got a little sailboat, and he'd sail back and forth because we didn't have motors in boats, you know. Almost not at all. Established the first boat building business on the island. At first it was all sailboats, and later on there were motors became available, so he built motorboats. And he employed an engineer and built an addition onto his shop for that purpose, and built motorboats from then on, and some beautiful yachts, but mostly it was working boats, but the ones the fishermen used, you know, the Cortez fishermen had their boats built there.
Well, where was this boat yard established?
Well, there's a little marina still there, and it's the same piece of property and belongs in the same family yet, where that little marina is. They're just south of the Hugh Holmes property.
Anna, were there any organizations on the island at that time?
Well, civic organizations. You mean early, when we first moved down there, when we first had homesteads there and built our first homes? No, not really. Anything that you might come under that heading was when there was this scare about foreigners being brought in, and especially Chinese being brought in over the beaches. And I think there were some brought in over Florida's beaches. And of course, with government instruction, they did form an organization there to watch for that. And of course, we needed a representative, a government representative. So we petitioned for a we petitioned for someone to represent the government there. So we had a justice of the peace appointed, and that was Mr. Cunningham. That was Nelson Cunningham. He was justice of the peace. But we never had to exercise that vigilance freely, because no foreigners were ever brought in across our beaches that we know of. So that was a little organization that lived and died in just about a couple of years, 2 or 3 years.
Well, you say that there was a justice of the peace, and then organization. What people joined this organization? What organization was it?
All the men on the island were in that organization.
Did it have a name, or was it just a...
No, we never gave it a name that I know of.
Anna, would you please give me your full name again?
Well, my married name, Anna Maria Cobb Riles.
Good. I noticed at the beginning of the tape we missed a part of your name. Thank you for establishing it again. What year was this boat building establishment started?
Well, I think it was either 1902 or 1903, because I was very young and I don't remember exactly.
Well, speaking about being young, we have not established how you were born on the island.
Well, I was born the perfectly natural way. When my father and mother moved to the island, I think I've already established that they built two houses, the one in which they lived in, and then they built a second house when my arrival seemed imminent, and it was occupied by a family by the name of Mora, and Joe Mora and his wife, and I don't know her first name, but anyway, she was a certified midwife, and she delivered me very well indeed.
Evidently. Did Mrs. Mora live there for any length of time? Or?
Well, yes, they lived there 2 or 3 years, and he was a commercial fisherman, and of course the shipping point for the fish was at the village of Cortez across on the mainland from the island, and they moved over there for his convenience then.
Now, you said that Mr. Hall was born on the island later. Could Mrs. Moore...
Clarence Hall.
Clarence Hall.
Yeah.
Was Mrs. Moore involved in his birth?
No.
Do you know? No.
No, I don't know who delivered Clarence.
Could you describe the businesses that were over in Cortez at that, in the early remembrances?
Well, there was a grocery store there, operated by a Mr. and Mrs. Bratton, Bratton, and they had the post office, and they also had other things besides food, like sewing materials and threads and needles and buttons and all those little things that you don't want to go to Tampa to get, you know. That's a long voyage. It was then by sail. And then the Brattons retired, and the store was taken over by Mr. Brown. And I think he still has a descendant living around Cortez, maybe, or somewhere in Florida.
There was the boat docks there?
And there was the docks there where the schooners first and then the steamboat landed and took on the loads of mullet. Mullet was the fish most caught, although other fish were caught and shipped, but it was just tons of mullet, you know, were shipped. Some salted, some fresh and iced down. And they were shipped to markets in Tampa, Jacksonville, all over Florida, and other states, too, by rail.
The question comes to mind, have you experienced any hurricanes the time that you were living on the island? Any natural disasters of any kind?
Yes, we went through some hurricanes. I can remember one when the Davis family, and that's Mitch Davis, and he was well known on the island, and his wife is still living, Lillian. And he was farming my father's farmland, and that was about 1913, I guess, somewhere along there. We had a real hurricane, and the house that they occupied, one of my father's houses, 2 houses, was a 1-story house, and ours was a 2-story house, and our 2-story house had gone through some hurricanes safely, but my father thought, well, that was coming from the west, and our house was vulnerable to the high winds that come off the Gulf, and we'd better spend that night in the 1-story house that the Davises occupied. So that's what we did, and Papa used 2x4s and propped up the 2-story house around, especially on the west side to keep it from blowing from east to west over, you know. And the Gulf rose and beat against the bluff and ran over the bluff and ran from Gulf to Bay right across the island in front of the small house that we occupied. And that's the part of the main street that crosses where the two banks are. That was the street where the Gulf ran from the beach to the bay side that night. And both houses stood it just fine. The two-story house was not even shaken. So naturally we moved back into the two-story house the next morning.
Is that the only storm that you recall?
No, I've been through some other ones when the first bridge between Anna Maria and Longboat was carried away. That was a pretty bad one.
And what year was that, do you recall?
No, I don't recall exactly. It was later than this one, first one I mentioned, several years later.
You were living away in a distance from that South End Bridge. Did you see the bridge the next day, or the damage that was caused to the bridge the next day, or?
No, I didn't. I don't remember why, because I rushed to see everything that happened on the island, you know. But I must have been occupied with something else, but I didn't see it. But I heard that the bridge was completely carried away and went ashore somewhere further south.
How long had that bridge been put up before it had been?
Several years.
Several years.
It was a wood construction.
Now, in these years now, you have not mentioned anything about your brother and your sister. Are they still at home, or have they moved away, or?
Well, they were at home until my sister was about 12 years old, I guess, and that would make me 6 years old. Or perhaps she was 13 and I was 7. That must have been the year after we returned from a year in Tampa, that she was sent to Terracea Island to go to school, because there was no school on the island that year. And of course I received my instruction from my mother. She had been a school teacher, so I wasn't neglected.
And in the early days, what piers and docks were around there?
Well, starting at the south end of the dock, there was these people who had the cottages, summer cottages down there, had a dock that schooners and a steamboat could land at. And then our own dock in the middle of the island was, we had many shipments of lumber and hardware and stuff like that delivered to ours.
Well, was that dock
And then
established at Gulf Park, or the Sandpiper? Is that the dock that?
Well, the Ilexhurst dock was a long dock to the steamer channel and had a warehouse on the end, and that's where freight was delivered. But that was early, you know, and in 1911, the municipal pier in Anna Maria was started, and the Hall family's dock was just a little north of that, and of course that was abandoned after the long pier was built. And then the little steamboat that used to run up and down from between Tampa and Sarasota was originally called the Mistletoe, and it was rebuilt at one time into a little larger, a little more modern steamboat, and called the General J.B. Carr. And people took that trip from Tampa to Sarasota one day and back to Tampa the next day for the scenery and also the wonderful cuisine. The food was so marvelous, they said, on that boat. It was very popular, just as a pleasure trip besides the necessary trips. And then after the pier at Anna Maria was built, and then the excursion steamers started coming with great groups of people, crowds. On Sunday, 2 big steamers would come loaded with people, and on the midweek, there'd be 1 steamer anyway, often came, all through the summer, and even winter people came and bathed, because they considered the Gulf water warm, even in winter.
Beginning of progress to Anna Maria Island.
Yes, and then there's a bathhouse built on the Gulf shore, the Gulf Beach, and the hotel built there, and a grocery store at the foot of the pier, and they had rooms also to rent on the 2nd story, and about 2 lots north of the grocery store, Mr. McIntosh built an apartment house. It had 4 apartments and 2 extra bedrooms that could be rented just for sleeping.
Well, let's go further into your life now. What did you do when your sister had moved away? Were there many people around in those days?
Well, when my sister went to school, had to go away to go to school because there was no school that year on the island, and I was just a youngster, 8 years old, I guess. And my brother was away also. At first he was away at school, and then he was apprenticed as a junior officer on the steamboat. And
which steamboat was that now?
that was the General Davy Carr. And he ran on that right up to, I guess, when he was about 18 or 19, he was on one of the bigger steamers as an officer. And I was at home alone a great deal. There were very few families on the island, and only occasional visitors there for any other children. And there was a stretch of a couple of years there was not even any school, but of course my mother, ex-school teacher, kept me up with my studies. But it was a lonely life for one child.
Well, what happened after that then? You grew up?
What happened after that? Well, I grew up and I also went to school in Tampa. I was in the convent a couple of years when I was 13 and 14. And then later I went to Tampa Business College, took a secretarial course.
And then you had been coming back to the island, though, also?
Oh, yes. When I was in, after we moved to Tampa. Well, I think we come right up to World War I now, haven't we? World War I. My father was instructed to close out his business and report to the nearest shipyard. Well, that was Tampa, which he did. And I was a married woman, and I had married when I was not quite 16 years old to Harry McIntosh.
That's the same gentleman who had built the apartments, or
the son of the man who built the apartment building there on the island. And we had been living on the property that my father and mother deeded to me. They had a 10-acre strip that was beside their 160-acre homestead, and they cut that into 3 parts, and my brother got the part with the bay shore, and I got the middle part. My sister got the middle part where the savings bank is now, and I got the other part that was west of that. And we had a little house on that property and lived there, Harry and I. And then we moved to to Tampa when the war broke out, and he worked for the government building cantonments. They're called camps now, I think, for the soldiers as they were gathered together and trained, you know.
Now, the property where your house was, would that be established where the S&S Plaza is now?
Yeah,
That little shopping
that's
center
right.
there?
That property right there. The last lot I sold is where, the man in Palmetto has the building on it. Boyd, Wilbur Boyd,
Oh.
the Boyd building.
Now, what happened to the other 160 acres?
Well, to begin with, a good part of it was laid out in blocks and lots and streets and boulevards and all that stuff. And the lots were sold from time to time, but my parents had given me some lots and my sister and my brother lots right along on the Gulf Boulevard. But unfortunately, hurricanes took away not only the beach in front of us, but those lots. So they were a dead loss. But still, we had a good many lots and some acreage. Now, this is a funny little story that I don't know whether it belongs in history or not, but I'll tell it anyway. My brother wanted a motorcycle one time, and he just thought he had to have a motorcycle. So my mother sold a couple of lots and bought him the motorcycle. Well, it wouldn't operate on the beach at all, but he was in Tampa a good part of the time. So one time when he was riding his motorcycle, he and a train sort of tangled, and he jumped off the motorcycle went under the train, and that was the end of the motorcycle.
Oh.
So the next thing he wanted was a racing boat he saw in Sarasota. So Mother sold a couple of lots and bought him the racing boat. And he found it was not safe at all. So, of course, he remodeled it and widened it. It was no longer a racing boat, but a very nice pleasure boat.
Well, that's how the lots disappeared then, huh?
That's how some of the lots went, but they also served some useful purposes. And the acreage was all sold, you know, a piece here and a piece there, until my mother ended up with, several acres and a half on it, which my sister inherited.
Maybe a sad point, but when did your father pass away and your mother pass away?
Well, my father passed away after World War years after World War I. Must have been about after World War II.
Then you were in Tampa at the
Yes,
time.
yes, living in Tampa. But my parents had gone back to the island. I was still living in Tampa. But my parents had gone back to the island, yes, and he passed away there.
And your mother?
Yes, my mother also passed away in that same two-story house that was built when they moved there. Later on, she outlived him several years.
Now, you went to Tampa, you were married, you'd gone to school, and you had studied business, right?
That's right.
After World War II, you came back to the island?
Well, my first husband's Harry McIntosh, and my marriage ended in divorce. And later on, I remarried. I married Franklin Arthur Riles.
Now, this was in Tampa?
That was in Tampa. And at that time, I was working as secretary, and he was also working. not at the same job all the time. And then he enlisted in World War II and served 4 years in the Army Air Force. And when he came back, he no longer wanted to live in Tampa. He was just, he was not very happy in Tampa before he enlisted, and afterward he was just, had no desire to live in Tampa. He wanted to live on the island. So he went down to the island and built a house for us, and with his own hands. And
on what property?
When he finished, on the same property that my mother had given me, my parents had given me. And that was just about where the shopping center is now. The house was there. And we lived in it several years and then sold the property and moved in to Bradenton, where I am now.
Terrific. What businesses had you gone into with Mr. Riles?
Well, we went into the fruit business, that is, mail order business. And we operated that for about 3 years, and we shipped Mixon's fruit, and they weren't acquainted with the mail order business, but they got acquainted through us, the mail order business, and they wanted to start up a mail order business, and we had already decided we wanted to do something else entirely. So we just turned it over to them. We'd got it started, and we turned what we had over to the Mixons, and they have a very nice business going now. And then we built a building for a dry cleaning establishment, and that was the first building in that S&S shopping center. And we sold that and came out very, very well on that deal. And then we kept selling the property a little bit at a time as the people wanted it. And we installed some laundries. We bought and sold a laundry in Okeechobee City, and that was a good deal. Then we installed a couple of other ones, and one of them was a disaster. It was a big dry cleaning establishment, and that was a disaster. So we abandoned that and bought a candy factory in Tampa and operated that. And then we sold that, and we came out good on that deal. So then we decided that we would just sort of retire. So, is it going?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I got into the newspaper work just in the most ridiculous way you can think of. When Art was down on the island building our house, he was helping out one of the fire departments that just organized, and he had a duplicating machine, and he ran thousands of flyers, little ads, ads on a sheet of paper, and had them dropped from an airplane over, I don't know how many counties, 2 or 3 counties, and so many people came to that barbecue or whatever it was, that they had to go out and start all over again and get a lot more chicken or a lot more fish or something, and cook it, and it was a great success. And people said, well, why don't you get out some kind of a little news thing like that? You did so well on this. We need a newspaper that just belongs to Anna Maria Island, So he got to running this little thing on his mimeograph machine, and it was very popular and grew and grew and grew, and finally I got so tired of doing that because I was still working in Tampa I hadn't given up my job. My husband was building our house, and we just had a little cottage there.
Or were you commuting from Tampa to?
I was still in Tampa when that was going on, you know, and working. And so I'd go down there weekends, and we'd get out a little newspaper. And I got tired of that. Well, after a while, we gave that up, and I moved down to the island. And my husband said it was that or else, you know. He was ready to move into our house. He said, now the house is ready, you're going to come down here. So I did. I gave up my job in Tampa and came down to the island. And then I was offered editorship of the Tampa News. Well, I accepted that. And I worked 6 months on that job, and I enjoyed it very much. But I have a cousin that was in the war, and his wartime service was over, and he was coming home, and he had some money coming to him, and he spent some of that money to buy the Family News. So he was his own editor, and that took me out of the the newspaper job.
What was his name?
Steve Raymond.
Steve Raymond. Put you right out of business.
Yep, took me out of business.
And what did you do then?
Well, from then on, it was business right on. As I said, we bought a candy factory in Tampa and operated that. And we installed some laundries and dry cleaning plants. And well, finally, I just decided I was going to retire, and I did retire for a time. But I saw a blind ad in the paper and for a secretary, and I was getting bored. So I answered by letter to a post office box, and I found out it was Montgomery Roberts' store. And I went there to work at 57 years of age. And I worked there 8 years till I was 65, and I retired then again.
Well, you've seen a great deal of progress, development, and growth on the island. What stands up most in your mind to how the island has developed in these years?
What stands up most in my mind, and I'm not too happy about it, are the high rises. They were going to hold that down and have nothing taller than 3 stories, but they're getting up there now. They're getting higher and higher, and I think that one of the things about high rises all the time and very expensive places like that cuts out the people of moderate means, and the island of Anna Maria was intended mostly for the happiness and comfort of people of moderate means. And I hope that there will always be places of that kind there.
Of your entire life now, and your memories of Anna Maria Island, can you come up with your happiest memories of your childhood? To finish up.
Well, Christmas was wonderful because the families got together, and Christmas Eve there was a Christmas tree, and there was goodies for all the children, and there were songs, and there were speeches, and it was just fairyland, you know, just absolutely fairyland to us. And the cedar trees, my father would go into the forest and pick out a tree well in advance that he was going to use, and it would be a beautiful cedar tree. And actual candles were used then, you know, no electric lights. And they had little tin holders for a candle and a cup sort of so the wax wouldn't run on anything else, you know. And they clipped onto the branches of the trees, and when that was lit, oh, that was something. And Santa Claus would come in the Santa Claus suits, you know, and distribute gifts, and we loved Christmas.
And you talk about the forest. Now, is this the forest on Anna Maria Island?
Oh, yes, there was forest on Anna Maria Island. The part of the island, all up and down the island, that next to the Gulf, next to the beach, was clear like prairie land with just a few little clumps of trees on it, and sea oats and things like that. But the half of the, just about half of the island was a deep forest on the bay side. There was mangroves all along the shore, and then the hardwood trees like oak groves and cedars and other trees, and oh, you could get a beautiful cedar tree most anywhere along the island. There's cedar trees still on the island, and but it's so different now that of course the forest had to be deforested in order to make room for houses and streets and everything like that. You just can't imagine what it was like then, you know, with in fact, where my parents built their house was a solid forest because they were on the bay side and not right close to the bay, but within about 100 yards. And they just cut a square out of the forest and slayed the trees, you know. But there was walls, solid walls of trees around the house, just outside our yard, our little yard, and a path cut through that forest to the prairie land on the Gulf side to get to the beach, and another path like that to the bay to reach our dock, and just walls of trees on each side, and wild animals in the forest, including wildcats. And
You mean like bobcats?
yeah, bobcats, wildcats, the long-tailed ones, the big ones,
Like Florida?
and raccoons, and rabbits, and rattlesnakes, and black snakes, and
Have you met up with
chicken
any
snakes,
rattlesnakes in your
and
time?
all kinds of snakes, you know.
Have you had any experiences to relate about the rattlesnakes or anything?
Well, yes, our neighbor, John R. Jones, was struck by a rattlesnake, and they had trouble for a long time, for years, and he did just what he thought was the right thing, was to wash it in alcohol and then drink some alcohol. And 2 days later, he awoke from his drunk and seemed to be all right. He did have some trouble with his leg later, but that was about the only thing that squeezed the blood at, you know, and even cut around a rattlesnake bite and squeeze the blood out was the only thing that they had to do then. They didn't have any other way to do it, wash it with alcohol. And
Speaking about being struck by something, I'm going to talk about mosquitoes now.
oh, well, you can imagine with a forest like that what the mosquitoes were like. They were just in clouds. They were terrible. We used smudges in the summertime, late in the afternoon, when the mosquitoes would be coming out to get their evening meal off of us. We would build smudges around the house, and that's a fire on which you throw green branches to make a smoke. And we'd also have to build such a smudge in the house sometimes to kill the mosquitoes in the house. And of course, lemon now is a good repellent, and we do that. We had lemon trees, but not when I was a very small child, because it takes a few years to grow trees, you know. But when the lemon trees got up big enough, we could take the leaves and rub them between our hands, and then rub that on our, or the peel, and rub it on our arms and necks and faces. It would repel the mosquitoes fairly good. But as the land became cleared and low places filled in and drained, the mosquitoes became less and less. But it was really bad when the people first moved to the island, and everybody that lived on the bay side wished sometimes they lived on the Gulf side. We had an experience with a wildcat when I was a very small child, but I distinctly remember it. my brother and sister and I were walking down that path from our house to the dock where we had boats tied up. And there were some little clearings that my father had made by the side of the road where he would pile lumber until he was ready to use it when he'd receive lumber from Tampa. And there was an old palmetto log in one of those little clearings, and as we came up to that little place, there was a wildcat that had evidently been sleeping on the log. And our conversation woke him up, and he acted like anyone would when they first wake up. He just stretched and arched his back and sunk his claws into the log and opened his mouth in a big yawn. Well, we thought he was just ready to pounce on us and eat us up, you know, and we just ran for the dock screaming at the tops of our voices and got in a rowboat and rowed out from the dock, and we thought that cats wouldn't swim. Well, domestic cats don't swim, but wild cats do. My mother came running because we'd screamed, you know. Well, the wildcat was gone. I guess it was more frightened than we were. And she never saw the wildcat.
Had to take your word for it then.
Had to take our word for it. Yes, I said wildcats would swim, and they would when they were burning off brush and trees and things, clearing land on the mainland across from the island. The wildcats would swim to our island. But there were wildcats on the island right up to 1913 because I saw one there. And 1913 or 14 was the last one I ever saw on the island. I guess that was the last one.
Well, Anna Maria Riles, Anna Maria Cobb Riles, I'd like to thank you very much for all the hours that you have donated to Anna Maria Island on this tape, and it's been a joy talking to you very much.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me. I don't know how many people like to hear me talk. It was fun. It was fun.
Well, I'm sure the people are going to enjoy hearing the history of Anna Maria Island from Anna Maria's words. I was wondering if anybody listening to this tape had further questions. Would they be able to ask you?
Well, I'd rather have it by letter than any other way, and I will answer to the best of my ability any letters that I received.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, and again, our heartfelt appreciation and thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
I'd like to have it on this tape that Anna Riles is writing a book, and hopefully will be published in the very near future. So please keep your eyes out to the bookstores, libraries, and be sure to look for this book and purchase it when it comes out. I'm sure you'll find it very interesting.